The temple steps were cold beneath Empress Aurelia's feet. She hadn't meant to walk this path tonight. She'd been returning from the Senate chambers, where she'd spent another fruitless evening trying to convince her husband's advisors that the grain dole should be expanded to include more of Rome's poor. They'd dismissed her suggestions with patronizing tolerance, and she'd left feeling frustrated and powerless. But then she'd heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it. A cry, weak, desperate, unmistakably human, and unmistakably young. Aurelia stopped, her imperial guards halting behind her. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning toward the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, which loomed above them in the moonlight. "Hear what, Domina?" Tribune Cassius asked, his hand moving to his gladius. "A child," Aurelia said, already moving toward the temple steps. "Someone's abandoned a child." At the top of the steps, partially hidden in the shadows of a massive column, she found it, a newborn. No more than a day or two old, wrapped in rough wool cloth that spoke of poverty. The infant's face was red from crying, its tiny fists clenched, its body trembling in the cold night air. "Gods," Aurelia breathed, dropping to her knees beside the baby. Without hesitation, she scooped the child into her arms, holding it against her chest for warmth. The infant's crying quieted almost immediately, as if recognizing safety. "Domina, you shouldn't." Cassius tried, but Aurelia wasn't listening. She examined the child carefully. The baby appeared healthy despite its abandonment. No obvious deformities, no signs of illness. Just cold, hungry, and desperately in need of care. "Someone left this child here to die," Aurelia said, and her voice carried an edge that made even her battle-hardened guards uncomfortable. "Left it on the temple steps like an offering to the gods." "It's traditional, Domina," Cassius said carefully. "When families cannot support another child, they bring them to the temples. Sometimes the priests take them in. Sometimes wealthy families claim them. Sometimes they die of exposure," Aurelia finished flatly. "Yes, I'm familiar with the tradition. I'm also familiar with the fact that it's barbaric." She stood, the baby still cradled against her. "We're returning to the palace. Now." "Empress," Cassius said, genuine alarm in his voice. "You cannot bring that child into the imperial palace. The priests, the emperor, there are laws about ritual purity." "I am Empress of Rome," Aurelia interrupted, her voice cold as marble. "And I will not leave a helpless infant to die on temple steps while I sleep in silk and eat from golden plates. If that offends the priests or my husband, they are welcome to tell me so directly." The guards exchanged worried glances but said nothing more. The walk back to the palace took 20 minutes, and with each step, Aurelia felt the weight of what she was doing. She knew this would cause problems. Bringing a foundling into the imperial household violated numerous traditions and possibly several laws. But she was tired of being a decorative empress, expected to produce heirs and otherwise remain silent. She was tired of watching injustice and being told it was tradition. If she couldn't change Rome's policies, she could at least save one child. That was something. The palace was quiet when they arrived. Aurelia went directly to her private chambers, calling for her attendants. "Bring me a wet nurse," she commanded, "immediately, and clean linens, warm water, whatever an infant needs." Her attendants scattered. Within minutes, an older woman arrived, one of the palace servants who had recently given birth. "What is your name?" Aurelia asked. "Livia, Domina," the woman replied nervously. "Livia, this child needs milk. Can you provide it?" Livia glanced at the guards, the other attendants, clearly uncertain. But the baby began crying again, a sound that transcended social boundaries. "Of course, Domina," Livia said quietly, holding out her arms. Aurelia watched as Livia nursed the foundling, as the infant's crying gradually quieted. The sight filled her with satisfaction that she'd been able to help, and apprehension about what would happen when her husband learned what she'd done. She didn't have to wait long. Emperor Marcus Severus burst into her chambers an hour later, still wearing his evening toga, his face flushed with anger. Behind him came 3 priests from the temple of Jupiter, their expressions grave. "What?" Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Have you done?" Aurelia stood to face him, positioning herself between the emperor and the sleeping infant. "I saved a child's life, a child that was abandoned on the temple steps. I brought it here, had it fed and warmed, and intend to see that it's properly cared for." "You brought a foundling into the imperial palace," Marcus said, his voice rising. "A child of unknown parentage, possibly carrying disease, certainly ritually impure. into the sacred heart of Rome's government. Do you understand what you've done? I understand perfectly, Aurelia replied calmly. I've done what any decent person should do when they find a dying infant. I've saved its life. At what cost? The high priest of Jupiter interjected. The imperial palace is sacred ground, Empress. It must remain pure, untainted by contact with those of uncertain lineage. By bringing this child here, you've polluted the entire household. Polluted, Aurelia repeated, her voice dropping to something more dangerous than a shout. You call saving a life pollution? You call mercy defilement? Tell me, high priest, what god do you worship that values ritual purity over human compassion? The gods whose favor protects Rome, the priest shot back. The gods whose will maintains proper order. The gods who decree that bloodlines matter, that purity must be maintained. Then your gods are cruel, Aurelia said flatly, and I want nothing to do with them. The room went deathly silent. One did not, even as Empress, openly denounce the gods. Marcus's face had gone pale. Aurelia, he said, something like pleading in his voice, you must understand the position you're putting me in. Even I must respect the boundaries set by divine law. The priests are right. Bringing a foundling into the palace violates sacred tradition. You must send it away. No, Aurelia said simply. No. Marcus's voice rose. You dare refuse me? I am emperor. I command. Command what? Aurelia interrupted. Command me to let a child die? Command me to value tradition over life? I won't do it, Marcus. I can't. If being empress means accepting that some lives don't matter, then I don't want to be empress. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The priests looked scandalized. The guards looked uncomfortable. You've defied the gods, Marcus said finally, his voice carrying finality. You've brought impurity into the sacred household. You've rejected divine law. This cannot stand. Then what will you do? Aurelia asked quietly. Punish me for showing mercy? If necessary, Marcus replied, real pain in his expression. The Senate will convene tomorrow. They'll determine the appropriate response. But Aurelia, please, send the child away before it comes to that. I don't want to lose you over this. You won't lose me, Aurelia said softly. I'm standing right here, but if you force me to choose between this child's life and my position as Empress, I choose the child. Every time, without hesitation. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, admiration and fury warring in his expression. Then he turned and left, the priests following, already murmuring about emergency sessions and divine judgment. Aurelia returned to the sleeping infant, looking down at the tiny face that had caused such upheaval. I don't even know if you're a boy or girl, Aurelia murmured. Don't know your name, your family, anything about you, but I'm keeping you, whatever it costs. Livia, watching from the corner, spoke quietly. Domina, they'll take the child tomorrow. The Senate will order it. Perhaps, Aurelia acknowledged, but they'll have to take it from my arms. And I promise you, Livia, that won't be easy. Outside, the city slept, unaware that within the palace walls, an empress had just made a decision that would shake the foundations of the empire. That a single act of mercy would spark a crisis that would require an army to resolve. That a mother's love for a child she'd known for mere hours would prove stronger than the combined authority of emperor, priests, and senate. For now, Aurelia simply held the sleeping infant and prepared for the battle she knew was coming. A battle for one child's right to live, and perhaps for the soul of Rome itself. The Senate convened at dawn. Aurelia had not slept. She'd spent the night in her chambers with the infant, a girl she'd discovered, cradled against her chest, listening to the palace wake around her with the knowledge that her life was about to change irrevocably. Livia had stayed with her through the long hours, occasionally taking the baby so Aurelia could rest her arms, but mostly just sitting in supportive silence. The wet nurse understood, perhaps better than the nobles ever could, what it meant to hold a child's life in your hands and refuse to let go. They'll come for you soon, Livia said as the first light crept through the windows. The Senate will have made their decision by now. I know, Aurelia replied quietly, looking down at the sleeping infant. The baby had a shock of dark hair and surprisingly delicate features. In the dawn light she looked almost ethereal, certainly not like the pollution and defilement the priests had claimed. What will you do? Whatever I must, Aurelia said. But I won't abandon her, I won't. Tribune Cassius arrived shortly after, his expression grim. Empress, the Senate requests your presence. Immediately. Requests? Aurelia repeated with a bitter smile. How polite of them. She stood, still holding the infant, and wrapped her imperial stola around both of them. Very well. Let's not keep Rome's distinguished senators waiting. The walk to the Senate chamber felt longer than it should have. Servants and officials stopped to stare as she passed, the Empress carrying a common foundling as if it were her own child. Some looked sympathetic, most looked scandalized. All understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The Senate chamber was packed. Every senator in Rome seemed to have found a seat, and the gallery above was filled with citizens who had somehow learned of the scandal and wanted to witness the judgment firsthand. The air thrummed with anticipation and barely concealed hostility. Emperor Marcus sat on the raised dais, his expression carefully neutral. Beside him stood the high priest of Jupiter and two other senior priests, their white robes practically glowing in the morning light streaming through the chamber's high windows. Aurelia entered with her head held high, the infant still held protectively against her chest. The murmuring that had filled the chamber died immediately. Empress Aurelia, the chief senator, a man named Gaius Claudius, stood to address her. You have been summoned to answer charges of impiety, blasphemy, and defilement of sacred space. How do you plead? I plead innocent, Aurelia replied calmly, of all charges except compassion. If that's now a crime in Rome, then yes, I'm guilty. A ripple of reaction moved through the chamber. Gaius's expression darkened. This is not a matter for jest, Empress. You brought a foundling, a child of unknown and likely base origin, into the imperial palace. You defied explicit warnings from the priests. You rejected divine law in favor of your own judgment. These are serious offenses. What's serious? Aurelia replied, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, is a society that values ritual purity over human life. What's serious is leaving children to die on temple steps while we congratulate ourselves on our piety. What's serious is punishing mercy while calling it justice. You speak of mercy, the high priest interjected, but what you've done is bring curse upon Rome. That child was abandoned for a reason, likely born under inauspicious signs, or to parents of such low status that even they recognized it had no place in civilized society. By bringing it into the sacred palace, you've invited divine displeasure. If the gods are displeased by saving a child's life, Aurelia said coldly, then I question whether they deserve our worship. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Several senators stood, shouting denunciations. The priests looked apoplectic. Even Marcus shifted uncomfortably on his throne. Order! Gaius shouted, and gradually the chamber quieted. Empress, your words border on heresy. Do you truly reject the gods of Rome? I reject, Aurelia said carefully, any interpretation of divine will that demands we ignore suffering. I reject the idea that ritual purity matters more than human compassion. And I reject absolutely the notion that this child, she held up the infant, who had begun to wake and fuss, is somehow cursed or unworthy of life simply because of circumstances beyond her control. Her? Someone in the gallery called out. It's a girl? She's a girl, Aurelia confirmed, gently rocking the baby. A perfectly healthy, innocent girl who was left to die, and I refuse to participate in that death. If that makes me impious, so be it. Marcus finally spoke, his voice heavy with reluctance. Aurelia, you leave me no choice. The Senate cannot overlook such defiance. The priests cannot permit such defilement to stand unpunished. You must either renounce this action, return the child to the temple, and undergo ritual purification, or face the consequences of your defiance. What consequences? Aurelia asked, though she already knew. Exile, Marcus said quietly. Stripping of your titles and privileges. Expulsion from Rome. You would cease to be empress, cease to have any legal standing within the empire. Everything you are, everything you have, gone. For the sake of a foundling you've known for less than a day. The chamber waited for her response. Aurelia looked around at the assembled senators, men of power and privilege who had never known hunger, never faced desperate choices, never had to watch a child die because society deemed them unworthy of saving. She looked at the priests, wrapped in their ritual purity and moral certainty. She looked at her husband, who genuinely seemed pained by what he was being forced to do but was doing it anyway. And then she looked down at the infant in her arms, now fully awake and looking up at her with dark, trusting eyes. I will not return her to the temple, Aurelia said clearly. I will not abandon her to die. If that costs me my crown, my titles, my place in this city, So be it. Some things are more important than power. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Marcus stood, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of imperial authority. Aurelia of the house of Maxentius, you are hereby stripped of your title as Empress of Rome. Your marriage to me is dissolved. Your property and privileges are forfeit to the state. You are banished from Rome, never to return on pain of death. You will leave this city before sunset with nothing but the clothes on your back and— He paused, something like pain flickering across his face. And the child you've chosen over everything else. Aurelia bowed her head, accepting the judgment. As you command, divine Caesar. One more thing, the high priest added, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Let it be known throughout Rome that this woman is cursed. She has defied the gods, embraced impurity, and chosen blasphemy over duty. Any who aid her, shelter her, or show her kindness, risk sharing in her curse. Let her wander the world as a warning of what happens to those who place their own judgment above divine will. The pronouncement echoed through the chamber like a death sentence. Aurelia felt the weight of it, not just exile, but total isolation. She would be cast out with nothing, forbidden from even accepting help from others who might pity her situation. But she didn't waver, didn't beg for reconsideration, didn't even look back at Marcus as she turned and walked out of the Senate chamber. The infant still held close against her heart. The people of Rome lined the streets as she made her way toward the city gates. Many were crying, women especially, who understood in a way the senators never could what Aurelia had done and what it had cost her. Some reached out as if to touch her, then pulled back, fearful of the priest's curse. But many whispered blessings, called her brave, said she was the only one in the palace with a true heart. At the gates, Tribune Cassius met her one final time. Domina, former Domina, I've been ordered to escort you beyond the boundary stones. After that, you're on your own. I understand, Aurelia said quietly. They walked in silence past the city limits, past the markers that defined where Rome ended and the wider world began. At the final boundary stone, Cassius stopped. I'm sorry, he said simply. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. The brave thing. Thank you, Aurelia replied. That does help. She continued alone, walking away from the only life she'd ever known, carrying a child who had cost her everything. The road ahead was uncertain, dangerous, and lonely. She had no money, no supplies, no plan beyond keeping the infant alive for one more day. But she had something the Senate could never take from her. The knowledge that she'd chosen principle over power, compassion over comfort, love over law. Behind her, Rome continued its daily business, barely pausing to note the loss of its Empress. The Senate congratulated itself on defending divine order. The priests performed purification rituals. Life went on as if nothing significant had happened. But in the north, where the legions fought to expand Rome's borders, a messenger was riding hard toward the camp of General Maxentius. And when Rome's most feared commander learned what had been done to his daughter, the empire would discover that some fathers cannot be appeased with ritual and tradition. Some fathers come home with armies at their back and fury in their hearts. The storm was coming. Rome just didn't know it yet. The messenger reached General Maxentius's camp on the northern frontier 3 weeks after Aurelia's exile. 3 weeks during which the general had been planning his spring campaign against the Germanic tribes, reviewing troop positions, and dealing with the endless logistical complications of maintaining an army far from Rome's supply lines. 3 weeks during which he'd been completely unaware that his daughter had been stripped of everything and cast out like a criminal. The messenger, a young courier named Titus who had ridden 6 horses to death getting there, collapsed at the entrance to the command tent, gasping for breath. General Maxentius, he managed. Urgent news from Rome. Your daughter. Maxentius was at his side immediately. At 53, the general was still physically imposing, broad-shouldered, battle-scarred, with iron-gray hair and the kind of presence that made hardened soldiers stand straighter when he entered a room. They called him the Lion of the Empire, and he'd earned that title through 30 years of victories that had expanded Rome's borders further than any general since Julius Caesar. My daughter? Maxentius demanded, his voice sharp with sudden fear. What's happened? Is she ill? Injured? Worse, sir, Titus gasped. She's been exiled, stripped of her title, banished from Rome. They took everything from her, her crown, her status, her home. The emperor dissolved their marriage and cast her out with nothing but— He paused as if the detail were too absurd to be true, but an infant she'd rescued from temple steps. The command tent went silent. Tribune Valerius, Maxentius's second in command, exchanged worried glances with the other senior officers who'd been reviewing maps when the messenger arrived. "Explain," Maxentius said, his voice gone dangerously quiet. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out." Titus, still struggling to catch his breath, recounted everything he'd learned in Rome. How Aurelia had found an abandoned infant on the Temple of Jupiter's steps. How she'd brought the child into the palace despite warnings from priests and husband alike. How the Senate had convened to judge her for impiety and blasphemy. How she'd chosen exile over abandoning the child. How Rome had celebrated her fall. The priests declared her cursed. Titus finished. "Said anyone who aids her risks divine displeasure. She left the city alone, on foot, carrying only the infant. That was 3 weeks ago. No one knows where she went or if she's even still alive." Maxentius stood perfectly still for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate care, he removed his general's cloak and folded it neatly on the map table. "Valerius," he said calmly, "send word to all cohorts. We're breaking camp. The army marches south at first light." Valerius's eyes widened. "Sir, what about the Germanic campaign? The Emperor's orders were explicit. We're to secure the Rhine frontier before—" "The Emperor," Maxentius interrupted, his voice still dangerously calm, "has just made the gravest mistake of his reign. He cast out my daughter for showing mercy to a helpless child, for refusing to let an infant die on temple steps. Tell me, Valerius, does that sound like the action of a man who deserves my loyalty? General, I understand you're angry, but—" "Angry?" Maxentius finally raised his voice, and the sound was like thunder rolling across mountains. "They stripped my daughter of everything, humiliated her before the Senate, cast her out to die with nothing but the clothes on her back and an infant to care for. They called her cursed. They forbade anyone from helping her. And you think I'm merely angry?" He turned to face his assembled officers, and they all took an involuntary step back from the fury in his eyes. "I'm going to Rome," Maxentius said flatly. "I'm going to find my daughter, and I'm going to have a very pointed conversation with the Emperor about what happens when you harm a lion's family. Anyone who wishes to remain here and continue the campaign is welcome to do so. Anyone who wants to come with me, pack your gear. We leave at dawn." "Sir," one of the younger officers ventured, "the Emperor won't react well to this. He could charge you with abandoning your post, even treason." "Let him try," Maxentius said. "I've spent 30 years expanding his empire, winning his wars, dying in his name. I've put Rome's interests above my own family for 3 decades. No more. My daughter needs me. That's all that matters." He turned to Valerius. "Send runners to every cohort. Tell them what happened. Tell them I'm marching south to bring my daughter home. Tell them they can come or stay, but make sure they understand. This isn't about conquest or glory. This is about family, about justice, about reminding Rome that some things are more important than imperial politics." By morning, the decision was made. Not a single soldier chose to stay. 10,000 men struck camp, formed ranks, and began the march south. The Germanic tribes, who had been preparing for Rome's spring offensive, watched in bewilderment as the empire's most feared army simply turned around and left. Word spread ahead of them like wildfire. The Lion of the Empire was marching on Rome. 10,000 battle-hardened soldiers, veterans of a dozen campaigns, moving south with a speed that suggested fury rather than military precision. The Senate called emergency sessions. The Emperor mobilized the Praetorian Guard. Priests performed rituals to divine the god's will. Panic gripped the city as people tried to understand what was happening and what it meant. Some claimed Maxentius was staging a coup, planning to overthrow the emperor and seize power. Others said he'd gone mad with grief over his daughter's exile. Still others whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, Rome had finally pushed too far and now faced the consequences of punishing mercy while calling it justice. The army made camp outside Rome's walls 2 weeks after leaving the Rhine frontier. 10,000 men, their banners blazing red in the afternoon sun, their discipline perfect, their purpose clear. They didn't attack, didn't make demands, simply waited. General Maxentius stood at the front of his army, wearing full battle armor, his lion-crested helmet tucked under one arm. He looked up at the walls of Rome, the city he'd defended his entire life, the city that had cast out his daughter, and his expression was carved from stone. "Send word to the emperor," he told Valerius. "Tell him I wish to enter the city, alone, unarmed, I want to speak before the Senate. Sir, that's incredibly dangerous. If they arrest you, then you have 10,000 men to discuss the matter with them, Maxentius replied. But they won't arrest me. They're not that stupid. Send the message. The message was sent. The Senate debated for hours. The emperor paced his chambers, caught between anger at this insubordination and fear of what would happen if he denied the general's request. Finally, as the sun began to set, the city gates opened. General Maxentius rode into Rome alone, unarmed except for the ceremonial gladius that marked his rank. Citizens lined the streets, silent and watchful. Some remembered this man, the war hero who had always put Rome first, who had sacrificed years of his life on distant frontiers, who had missed his daughter's wedding because he'd been winning battles for the empire. And all of them wondered, what happens when Rome's greatest warrior finally says, enough? The Senate chamber was packed when Maxentius entered. Every senator present, the emperor on his throne, the priests in their places, the same room where Aurelia had been judged and condemned. Maxentius walked to the center of the chamber, his boots echoing on the marble floor. He didn't bow, didn't show the deference normally expected before the emperor, simply stood there, looking around at the assembled power of Rome with an expression that suggested he found them all wanting. You cast out my daughter, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, for the crime of saving a child's life, for showing mercy when the powerful demanded cruelty, for choosing compassion over ritual purity. He turned slowly, making eye contact with senators, with priests, with the emperor himself. I've spent 30 years fighting for Rome, 30 years expanding your borders, securing your frontiers, winning your wars. I've missed my daughter's childhood, her wedding, years of her life. Also, you could sit here in comfort and debate philosophy while I did the bloody work of empire. General, the emperor started, but Maxentius silenced him with a look. I'm not finished. You called her cursed, said anyone who helped her risked divine displeasure, cast her out to die with nothing but an infant to care for. And you thought, what? That I would simply accept this? That I would keep fighting your wars while my daughter wandered homeless because she dared to save a child? He took a step toward the emperor's throne. Where is she? We don't know, Marcus admitted quietly. She left Rome 3 weeks ago. No one has seen her since. Then you have a problem, Maxentius said, because I'm not leaving Rome until I find her, and my 10,000 men aren't leaving either. We'll camp outside your walls. We'll stop all trade, all traffic, all movement in and out of the city, and we'll wait, however long it takes. That's blackmail, a senator shouted. That's justice, Maxentius corrected. You cast out my daughter for mercy. Now you face the consequences. You thought you could punish compassion without cost. You were wrong. What do you want? The emperor asked. I want Rome to remember something it seems to have forgotten, Maxentius replied. That mercy matters. That kindness has value. That a society that punishes people for saving lives is a society that's lost its way. He looked directly at Marcus. My daughter chose an infant over her crown. She gave up everything for a child she'd known for hours. That's not impiety. That's the purest form of virtue Rome claims to value, and you punished her for it. The chamber was silent. Then, from somewhere in the gallery, a voice called out, The lion speaks truth. Another voice joined, Bring back the Empress. Within moments, the gallery erupted in shouts and cheers. The common people of Rome, who had wept when Aurelia was exiled, who had whispered her name with reverence, now gave voice to what they'd felt all along. Maxentius waited for the noise to die down, then spoke again. I'm going to find my daughter. I'm going to bring her home. And then, Emperor, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about what Rome truly stands for. Until then, he gestured to the walls. My army waits. Make your choice. He turned and walked out of the Senate chamber, leaving chaos in his wake. The siege of Rome had begun, not with weapons, but with a father's love. General Maxentius found his daughter on the 5th day of searching, not in Rome, where the Senate had assumed she would seek shelter, not in the nearby towns, where sympathetic citizens might have hidden her despite the priest's curse, but in a small village 15 miles from the city, working in exchange for food and lodging in a farmer's barn. The farmer, an elderly man named Lucius who had lost his own daughter years ago, had found Aurelia collapsed on the road, the infant crying in her arms, both of them near death from exposure and hunger. He'd taken them in, despite knowing who she was, despite the priest's warnings, despite everything. Couldn't let them die, he'd told his worried wife. Emperor or no emperor, priest or no priest. Wasn't right. Maxentius arrived at the farm just after dawn, riding alone, having left his personal guard at the village entrance to avoid frightening anyone. He dismounted slowly, seeing the simple barn, the modest house, and feeling a rage so profound it threatened to overwhelm him. This was where Rome's Empress had been reduced to, a farmer's charity and a bed of straw. Aurelia emerged from the barn carrying a bucket of milk, the infant strapped to her back in a makeshift sling. She'd lost weight, her hair was roughly cut, her hands bore the calluses of manual labor. She wore a simple peasant tunic that was patched in several places. She didn't recognize him at first, probably didn't expect to see her father, Rome's most feared general, standing in a farmer's yard at sunrise. Then their eyes met. The bucket fell from Aurelia's hands, milk spilling into the dirt. "Father," she whispered. Maxentius crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, careful not to crush the infant between them. Aurelia collapsed against his chest, and the composure she'd maintained for weeks finally shattered. She sobbed, great, shaking sobs that spoke of fear and exhaustion and overwhelming relief. "I've got you," Maxentius murmured, holding her close. "I've got you now. You're safe. They said I was cursed." Aurelia choked out between sobs. "Said anyone who helped me would suffer divine displeasure. I tried not to accept help, tried to keep moving, but I couldn't. The baby needed—" "Shh," Maxentius soothed, stroking her roughly cut hair. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing. Do you hear me? You saved a life. That's not a curse. That's the most noble thing a person can do." He pulled back to look at her, his hands on her shoulders. "Where is she? The child you saved. Let me see her." Aurelia carefully unstrapped the sling, revealing the infant, now about a month old, healthier than she'd been on the temple steps, but still small and fragile. The baby blinked up at Maxentius with dark, curious eyes. "She doesn't have a name," Aurelia said quietly. "I didn't feel I had the right to name her when I don't even know if I can keep her safe." Maxentius took the infant with the surprising gentleness of a man who'd held his own daughter decades ago. He examined the baby carefully, the way soldiers examine terrain, assessing threats and vulnerabilities. "She looks like you did," he said finally. Same eyes, same stubborn expression, even at this age. He looked at his daughter. "What were you going to name her?" "I thought—" "Lucia," Aurelia said. "It means light, and she was light in the darkness in a way. Finding her gave me purpose when I'd felt powerless for so long." "Lucia," Maxentius repeated, testing the name. The baby made a small sound, as if approving. "Good. Strong Roman name. She'll need that strength." He handed the infant back to Aurelia and turned toward the farmhouse, where Lucius had appeared in the doorway, looking terrified at the sight of a Roman general in his yard. "You," Maxentius called. "Come here." Lucius approached slowly, wringing his hands. "My lord, I meant no offense to Rome. I know the lady was exiled, but I couldn't let them die. I'm just an old farmer, I don't have much, but I couldn't—" "You did the right thing," Maxentius interrupted. "You showed mercy when Rome showed cruelty. You took in a desperate woman and a helpless child when the entire empire had turned its back. For that, you have my eternal gratitude." He reached into his belt and produced a heavy purse. "This is for your troubles, and for your courage in defying the priest's curse. When this is over, when my daughter is restored to her rightful place, I'll ensure you're properly rewarded." Lucius stared at the purse, then at the general. "I don't want reward, my lord. Just wanted to do right." "Which is exactly why you deserve it," Maxentius replied. "But we need to leave now. Rome needs to see what's become of its empress, needs to understand the cost of their judgment." He turned to his daughter. "Can you ride?" "I think so," Aurelia said. "Good. We're going back to Rome. Together. And this time," his expression hardened, "we're going to make them listen." The ride back to the city took most of the day. Maxentius set a steady pace, stopping frequently to let Aurelia rest and nurse Lucia. As they traveled, he told her about the army camped outside Rome's walls, about his confrontation with the Senate, about the people's reaction to her exile. "They call you Mother of Rome," he said. "Did you know? The common people. They've been saying it since you were cast out, that you showed more compassion than all the senators combined." "I just saved one child," Aurelia protested. "You did what they wouldn't," Maxentius corrected. "You put life above law, mercy above ritual. That matters, Aurelia. More than you know." They reached the army's camp as the sun was setting. The soldiers, who had been told to expect their general's return, stood at attention as Maxentius rode in, but their eyes went to the woman riding beside him, to the infant in her arms, to the visible evidence of Rome's cruelty. Maxentius dismounted and helped Aurelia down, then turned to address his assembled officers. "This," he said, his voice carrying across the camp, "is why we're here. This is what Rome did to a woman whose only crime was mercy. Look at her. Look at what they reduced her to. And ask yourselves, is this the empire we want to serve?" The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, one soldier knelt, then another, then another. Within moments, the entire army was on one knee, not in submission, but in respect, in acknowledgement, in solidarity with a woman who had lost everything for doing what was right. Aurelia, exhausted and overwhelmed, could only stare at the thousands of men paying homage to her compassion. "Tomorrow," Maxentius announced, "we enter Rome, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. We're going to show the Senate, the Emperor, and all of Rome what mercy looks like, and we're going to demand that they recognize it." That night, Maxentius had one more task. He summoned Tribune Valerius and gave him specific instructions. "Tomorrow, when we enter the city, I want every soldier to carry something. Not weapons, flowers, whatever you can find. Gather flowers from the fields. Buy them from merchants. Requisition them from gardens if you must. 10,000 soldiers, each carrying flowers instead of swords." Valerius blinked in surprise. "Sir, we're not invading Rome," Maxentius explained. "We're making a statement. That strength doesn't require violence. That real power lies in choosing compassion over cruelty. That an army can march for something other than conquest." He looked toward the tent where Aurelia slept with Lucia. "My daughter saved a child with nothing but her own courage. The least I can do is show Rome that even warriors understand the value of that choice." The next morning, as the sun rose over Rome, 10,000 soldiers formed ranks outside the city gates, and in each man's hand, not a sword, not a spear, but a flower. Red roses for courage, white lilies for purity, wildflowers of every color, creating a sea of color rather than steel. At the front of the formation, General Maxentius sat on his war horse, his daughter beside him, the infant Lucia cradled in Aurelia's arms. "Open the gates," Maxentius commanded, and slowly, as Rome watched in astonishment, the gates swung open. The siege was ending, but the real battle, for Rome's soul, was just beginning. The procession through Rome was unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. 10,000 soldiers marching in perfect formation, but carrying flowers instead of weapons. No war cries, no clash of shields, no display of martial power. Just silence, broken only by the rhythmic step of boots on stone and the gentle rustle of petals in the morning breeze. Citizens lined the streets, packed shoulder to shoulder. Many had heard rumors, but couldn't quite believe it until now. Rome's most feared army, marching through the city with flowers, and at the front, mounted on a white horse, rode Aurelia, no longer in peasant rags, but in a simple white stola, the color of mourning and supplication. In her arms, wrapped in clean linen, was Lucia. The infant was awake and quiet, her dark eyes taking in the spectacle with calm curiosity. She had no idea that thousands were staring at her, that she had become the focal point of a confrontation that would reshape Rome. As they approached the forum, the crowd grew denser. The Senate had assembled on the rostra, the raised platform from which Rome's leaders addressed the people. Emperor Marcus stood at the center, flanked by priests and senators. Maxentius raised his hand, and the army halted as one. The sudden silence was deafening. The general dismounted, then helped Aurelia down. Together they walked forward to stand before the Senate, before the emperor, before all of Rome. For a long moment no one spoke. It was Maxentius who finally broke the silence, his voice carrying across the forum. "Rome," he said simply, "look upon your Empress. Look at what you did to her." He gestured to Aurelia, to her thin frame and work-worn hands. "This woman, my daughter, committed one crime. She found a dying infant and chose to save it. She valued life over law, mercy over ritual. And for this, you stripped her of everything." He turned to face the emperor directly. "You call this justice. I call it cruelty, disguised as piety." The high priest stepped forward. "The general speaks from emotion, not wisdom. The gods' laws are clear. The imperial household must remain pure." "Pollution," Maxentius interrupted, his voice dangerous. "You keep using that word. Tell me, priest, what exactly is polluted about saving a child's life? The gods work in mysterious ways. The priest replied stiffly. That child was abandoned for a reason. Perhaps, Maxentius cut in, it was simply born to parents too poor to feed another mouth. Perhaps there's no divine mystery at all, just human cruelty that we excuse by calling it fate. He stepped closer to the Senate platform. You want to talk about divine will? Let's test it. Let's ask the gods themselves what they think of this child you declared cursed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I propose a trial, Maxentius announced. If this child is truly cursed, if the gods truly disapprove of my daughter's mercy, let them show us. Bring the infant to the temple of Jupiter. Let her spend one night beneath the sacred roof. If the gods reject her, they'll make it known. But if she survives unharmed, then perhaps we need to reconsider who's actually speaking for the divine. The high priest looked trapped. To refuse would suggest the priests lacked faith. To accept risked proving Maxentius's point. It's an affront to suggest testing the gods, the priest tried. Is it? Maxentius asked. Don't we examine entrails to determine the god's will? Don't we claim that Jupiter himself guides Rome? If that's true, surely he can make his opinion known about one infant. The crowd murmured, louder. The idea had caught their imagination. Emperor Marcus raised his hand for silence. Very well, he said reluctantly. We'll conduct the test. Tonight, the child will spend the night in the temple, watched over by witnesses. If the gods reject her, the original judgment stands. But if she survives unharmed, we'll reconsider. Not good enough, Maxentius said flatly. If she survives, my daughter is fully restored. Titles, status, everything. And the Senate acknowledges that mercy is not a crime in Rome. Several senators protested, but Marcus silenced them. Agreed. On one condition, if the gods reject the child, you return to your post and never speak of this again. Maxentius looked at his daughter. Aurelia finally spoke. I agree to the terms, she said clearly, but I stay with her. Whatever happens tonight, I'm not leaving Lucia alone. The test requires, the high priest began. I don't care, Aurelia interrupted. You want to test whether the gods approve of my choice? Fine, but I made that choice and I'll stand by it. If the gods want to punish someone, they can punish me. Maxentius smiled slightly. That's my daughter. The preparations took most of the day. The temple of Jupiter was cleared and purified. Witnesses were selected, priests, senators, and common citizens. Guards were posted. As night fell, Aurelia entered the temple carrying Lucia. Maxentius wanted to accompany her, but the priests insisted only the mother and child could be present. I'll be right outside, Maxentius told her. All night. Nothing will happen, Aurelia said with more confidence than she felt. The temple doors closed behind her. Inside, the space was vast and shadowy, lit only by the eternal flame before Jupiter's massive gold and ivory statue. Aurelia sat on the cold marble floor, Lucia in her arms, and waited. Hours passed. Lucia slept peacefully. Outside, thunder rumbled, a storm approaching. Aurelia didn't sleep. She sat against a pillar, holding Lucia close, and spoke quietly to the gods. I don't know if you're listening, she said to the darkness. But if you do, if divine will really governs Rome, then I'm asking you to show mercy. Not for me, for her. She's innocent. Lightning flashed outside. Thunder followed, closer now. They say I defied you by saving her, Aurelia continued. But what kind of gods would want a child to die? If that's what you represent, then maybe I did defy you, and I'd do it again. The storm broke overhead with sudden violence. Rain lashed the roof. Wind howled through the columns. Lightning struck somewhere close. Lucia woke with a startled cry, and Aurelia held her closer. Then, with a sound like the world splitting open, lightning struck the temple itself. The bolt came through the oculus, the opening in the roof, and struck the golden statue of Jupiter directly. The impact was blinding. Fire erupted across the statue, racing along the gold leaf, consuming the wooden core. Within seconds, the massive representation of Rome's king god was engulfed in flames. Aurelia curled around Lucia, protecting the infant from heat and falling debris. The priests' sacred icons, the offerings, the tapestries, all caught fire. Outside, witnesses watched in horror as flames erupted from the temple. Maxentius tried to rush inside, but the heat drove him back. Aurelia, he roared. Inside, Aurelia scrambled toward the exit, away from the inferno. The smoke was thick, choking, but she kept moving, kept protecting Lucia. She burst through the temple doors into the storm, coughing and stumbling. Maxentius caught her immediately. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "No," Aurelia gasped. "We're fine, both of us." She looked down at Lucia. The infant was crying from the noise but was completely unharmed. Not a single burn, not even a singe mark. The priests and witnesses stared, first at the burning temple, then at the infant who had survived unscathed. "The gods have spoken," someone in the crowd whispered. "Jupiter himself struck the temple." Another voice added, "But the child lives." A third said, "Untouched." The high priest fell to his knees, his face pale with shock. "The flames consumed the temple," he said hoarsely. "Destroyed our most sacred icons. But the child the gods supposedly cursed, she survives without a mark." Maxentius looked at the burning temple, at his daughter and the infant she'd saved, and felt fierce satisfaction. "I think," he said quietly, "the gods just told us exactly what they think of your judgment." The crowd erupted, not in panic, but in something like reverence. People fell to their knees. Others wept. Still others began calling out, "The gods have chosen her. The child is blessed, not cursed. Bring back the Empress." The high priest remained on his knees, staring at the burning temple. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "We were wrong. The gods have corrected us." Emperor Marcus stepped down from the rostra, approaching Aurelia slowly. His expression was complex. Shame, relief, resignation. "It appears," he said quietly, "that I owe you an apology, and much more than that." Aurelia, still holding Lucia, looked at the man who had been her husband. "What I want," she said, "is not an apology, but a promise. That no woman will ever be punished for mercy again. That no child will be called cursed for surviving. That Rome will remember this night." "It will," Marcus said. "I swear it." As the storm began to clear, as the first light of dawn touched the burning temple, Rome watched its empress stand vindicated, not by politics, not by power, but by the gods themselves. The restoration happened at dawn, as the ashes of Jupiter's temple still smoldered. Emperor Marcus summoned the entire Senate to the Forum, along with every citizen who could crowd into the space. The streets overflowed with Romans who had stayed awake all night, watching the temple burn, watching the miracle unfold. Aurelia stood before them all, Lucia in her arms, her father at her side. She was exhausted, smoke-stained, her white stola bearing scorch marks, but she stood straight, refusing to show weakness. "People of Rome," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Last night we witnessed something extraordinary. We asked the gods to show us their will regarding this child, this woman, and the mercy she showed. And the gods answered." He gestured to the burning temple. "Jupiter himself struck down his own temple rather than harm the infant we declared cursed. The flames consumed gold and marble, destroyed priceless offerings, but the child emerged untouched, not a single mark upon her." The crowd murmured agreement. "I stand before you now," Marcus continued, genuine humility in his tone, "to admit that Rome was wrong, that I was wrong. We punished mercy when we should have celebrated it. We called compassion a crime when we should have recognized it as virtue." He removed his purple-bordered toga and held it out. "Aurelia, daughter of Maxentius, I hereby restore you to your position as Empress of Rome. Your titles, your status, your honors, all are returned, and the child you saved is declared under imperial protection, to be raised with all privileges befitting her courage." Aurelia looked at the offered toga, at the thousands of faces watching. She thought about everything she'd lost, everything she'd endured, and she thought about the infant in her arms, who had survived it all. "I accept the restoration of my titles," Aurelia said clearly, "but not the marriage. That part of my life is over. I will serve Rome as Empress, but on my own terms, as a voice for those who have no voice, as a reminder that mercy matters more than tradition." Marcus nodded, as if he'd expected this. "As you wish. You will have your own household, your own income, your own authority, and Rome will listen when you speak." He turned to the high priest, who still knelt nearby. "As for the temple, we will rebuild it, but this time, at its entrance, we will place a statue, not of a god, but of a woman holding a child, so that everyone who enters remembers what happened here, remembers that the gods value life, not ritual." The high priest bowed his head, "As the emperor commands, and may I add that I was wrong, profoundly wrong. I let tradition blind me to truth. For that, I seek your forgiveness." I forgive you, Aurelia said simply. But forgiveness isn't enough. Actions matter more than words. Show me through your deeds that this moment changed you. I will, the priest promised. Maxentius stepped forward. One more thing, he said, his voice carrying the authority of Rome's greatest general. My daughter saved one child, but there are thousands more like Lucia, abandoned, unwanted, left to die on temple steps. He looked at the senators. Rome can do better. Starting today, I'm establishing a fund, using my own wealth, to create proper orphanages throughout the city, places where abandoned children can be taken, cared for, raised with dignity. No more leaving infants on temple steps and hoping the gods will sort it out. The crowd erupted in cheers. And I'm not doing this alone, Maxentius continued. Every senator, every wealthy family, every person of means, you will contribute, because after what we've witnessed, no one can claim ignorance anymore. We know children are being abandoned. We know they're dying, and now we have a choice. Senator after senator stood, pledging contributions. Whether from genuine conviction or political necessity, hardly mattered. The result would be the same. Rome's abandoned children would have a future. Aurelia watched it unfold, tears streaming down her face. She'd saved one life, but that one life had sparked a revolution. Lucia chose that moment to begin fussing, and Aurelia automatically shifted to comfort her. The gesture, so natural, so maternal, seemed to resonate with the watching crowd. People of Rome, Aurelia said, and the crowd quieted. I didn't set out to change the world. I just couldn't walk past a dying child. Couldn't ignore suffering when I had the power to help. That's all I did. She held Lucia up. This is Lucia. She was nobody. Had no family, no status, no prospects. By Rome's old logic, she didn't matter. But she matters to me. And because she matters to me, she now matters to all of you. One life, changing everything. She lowered the infant. We can't save everyone, but we can save someone. And if each of us commits to that, to seeing the suffering around us and refusing to look away, then Rome becomes more than an empire. It becomes a family. The cheering was deafening, continuing for several minutes. When it quieted, Emperor Marcus made one final proclamation. From this day forward, let it be known that Aurelia is not just Empress, but Mater Romae, Mother of Rome, not because she bore the city's children, but because she showed us how to care for them. Mater Romae. The title spread through the crowd like wildfire, repeated thousands of times. Mater Romae. Mater Romae, Mater Romae. Years passed. The orphanages that Maxentius funded became models throughout the empire. The practice of leaving infants on temple steps didn't disappear entirely, but now there were alternatives, places to turn, help to be found. Lucia grew up in the imperial household, raised by Aurelia with the same love she'd shown from the first moment. The girl was bright, curious, quick to defend those weaker than herself. She knew her story and understood that with that knowledge came responsibility. At 18, Lucia entered politics. At 25, she was appointed to the Senate, the first woman to hold that position. At 30, she became advisor to the emperor on social welfare. She never forgot where she'd come from. Aurelia lived to see her adopted daughter's success, lived to see Rome transform. She was 63 when she died, surrounded by family. Her funeral was unlike any Rome had ever seen. Not just nobles, but common people, thousands of them, lining the streets, holding candles, weeping openly. The procession passed the rebuilt Temple of Jupiter, where the promised statue stood, a woman in simple robes, holding an infant, cast in marble that seemed to glow. The inscription beneath read, Mater Romae. She chose mercy when Rome chose law. She chose life when Rome chose tradition. She chose love when Rome chose pride. But there was a second statue, commissioned by Lucia, that stood in every orphanage. This one showed Aurelia and Maxentius together, father and daughter, the infant between them. A reminder that change required courage, that justice needed champions. The inscription read, To the woman who defied an empire for love, and to the father who brought an empire to its knees. Decades later, when Lucia became the first female emperor of Rome, her first official act was to establish a new holiday, the Festival of Mercy. One day each year when all of Rome stopped to remember a night when lightning struck a temple, when a child survived impossible odds, when the gods themselves weighed in on the side of compassion. On that day, every family in Rome was required to perform one act of mercy: feed a hungry person, shelter someone in need, Visit the orphanages. Do something to honor the principle that one life could change the world. And in the imperial palace, in a place of honor, a single artifact remained under glass. The simple wool cloth that had wrapped Lucia when Aurelia first found her on the temple steps. Stained, worn, unremarkable except for what it represented. The moment when an empress chose compassion over power. The moment when Rome learned that mercy wasn't weakness, but the truest form of strength. The moment when everything changed. Because one woman looked at a dying child and said, "Not on my watch." And an empire listened. In the archives of the rebuilt temple, sealed in a bronze case, there was a letter, written in Aurelia's own hand during her final days. It read, "To whoever reads this, I didn't set out to be a hero. I was just a woman who couldn't walk past suffering. But that's all heroism really is, seeing what's wrong and refusing to accept it. I found a baby dying on temple steps, and I decided that was unacceptable. Everything else followed from that one decision. If there's a lesson in my story, it's this. Never underestimate the power of choosing compassion. Never assume that one person can't make a difference. I saved one child, but that one child changed an empire. Imagine what could happen if each of you saved one. With love, Aurelia." The letter remained there for centuries, read by every new emperor, a reminder of what Rome was supposed to be, a reminder that empires weren't built just by conquest and law, but by the simple revolutionary act of caring, of choosing mercy, of refusing to look away.